Something that has never happened in Federal Reserve history just happened. January 28th, 2026. Two Fed governors vote against Powell publicly. They wanted rate cuts. Powell refused. One of those governors, Chris Waller, Trump's pick to replace Powell. This wasn't policy debate. This was a $36 trillion takeover from the inside. When your debt hits $36 trillion, when every 1% rate increase costs $360 billion you can't pay, and when you can't legally fire the Fed chairman, you infiltrate. Same pattern that killed the gold standard in 1971. Same pattern that triggered 2008 money printing. It's executing again right now. Stage 3 of 4. And your dollars are in the crossfire. Let me be very clear about what happened on January 28th, 2026, because the way the media covered this completely missed the actual story. The Federal Open Market Committee meeting. Jerome Powell, Fed chairman, announces the decision. Rates stay at 4.25 to 4.5%. Standard procedure. Except when the vote came, two governors dissented, not in the polite technical way that occasionally happens. They voted for a rate cut, a full 25 basis point reduction against the chairman's recommendation in public with their names attached. Chris Waller, one of the two, the other Beth Hammock. Now, here's what you need to understand about Fed culture. Dissenting votes happen, but they're rare. And when they do happen, they're usually one governor quietly documented in the minutes, forgotten by next week. This was different. Two governors, coordinated, public, and demanding the exact opposite of what Powell wanted. Not a tweak, not a delay, the opposite direction. Why does this matter? Because Chris Waller isn't just any Fed governor appointed by Trump in 2020, economist, former research director at the St. Louis Fed. And according to 3 separate reports from Bloomberg, Reuters, and the Wall Street Journal over the past 6 months, he's Trump's preferred candidate to replace Powell when Powell's term as chairman ends in May 2026, 4 months from now. So, let me connect the dots for you. Trump wants lower rates. He's been public about this since 2018. He's called Powell an enemy. He said the Fed is hurting the economy. He's demanded rate cuts on Twitter, on Truth Social, in rallies and interviews. But legally, Trump cannot fire Powell. The Federal Reserve Act protects Fed independence. The chairman serves a 4-year term. Powell's term ends May 2026. Trump cannot remove him early. But Trump can do something else. He can position his replacement, and he can have that replacement start signaling policy preference now publicly on the record so that when the transition happens in May, the market already knows what's coming. This is exactly what Waller's vote was. It wasn't about economic data. It wasn't about inflation targets. It was about positioning. And here's the part that should terrify you. The last time a sitting president openly pressured the Fed chairman like this, the last time political interference became this obvious, we got 2 outcomes. 1971, Nixon and Arthur Burns. Dollar off gold, currency collapse begins. 2008, Bush and Bernanke, rates to zero, money printing begins. Both times the pattern was identical. President needs cheap money. Fed chairman resists. President applies pressure. Fed eventually complies. Currency debases. We're watching it happen again. Stage 3, the political interference phase. And Waller's vote on January 28th wasn't the beginning. It was confirmation that we're already deep into execution. So why does Trump need rate cuts so badly that he's willing to execute an internal Fed takeover? One number, 36 trillion. That's the U.S. national debt as of January 2026. Not 36 billion, not 36 million. 36 trillion with a T. Now let me show you the math that makes this a crisis. The U.S. government pays interest on that debt. The interest rate it pays is directly influenced by the Fed's policy rate. Right now, with rates at 4.25%, the U.S. is paying roughly 1.5 trillion per year just in interest. Not paying down the debt, not funding programs, just interest. That's more than the entire defense budget, more than Medicare. It's the second largest line item in the federal budget after Social Security. Here's where it gets worse. Every time the Fed raises rates by 1%, the interest cost goes up by approximately $360 billion per year. Let me say that again. Every 1% rate increase costs the U.S. government $360 billion annually in additional interest payments. And that assumes the debt doesn't grow, but the debt is growing. The U.S. is running a $2 trillion deficit this year. That means $2 trillion in new debt added on top of the $36 trillion. So do the math with me. If Powell keeps rates at 4.25%, interest costs are $1.5 trillion per year. If Powell raises rates to 5.25%, interest costs jump to $1.86 trillion. If rates go to 6%, which is where they were in 2023, interest costs hit $2.16 trillion per year. At that point, interest payments consume more than all individual income tax revenue. The government literally cannot pay the interest without either cutting everything else or printing money. This is the box Trump is in. He cannot cut spending enough to matter. Social Security, Medicare, defense, these are politically untouchable. He cannot raise taxes enough. The economy is already fragile, and raising taxes in an election cycle is suicide. He cannot grow his way out. GDP growth of 2 to 3% per year doesn't touch a debt growing at $2 trillion per year. That leaves one option: debase the currency, print money, inflate the debt away. But to do that, you need the Fed to cooperate. You need low interest rates so the government can borrow cheaply. And you need the Fed to buy government bonds, which is money printing with extra steps. Powell won't do it. Powell's mandate is price stability. He saw what happened in 2021 and 2022 when the Fed printed too much. Inflation hit 9%, the worst in 40 years. Powell's job is to prevent that from happening again. But Trump's job is to survive the debt. And those two jobs are incompatible. Powell wants to protect the dollar's value. Trump needs to debase it to pay the interest. You cannot have both. One of them has to lose. And since Trump can't fire Powell, Trump's strategy is to replace him in May with someone who will cut rates and print. Chris Waller just raised his hand. This is not speculation. This is mechanical. The debt cannot be paid at current rates. The deficit cannot be closed with current policy. The only way out is money printing. And money printing requires Fed cooperation. And Fed cooperation requires removing Powell and installing someone compliant. We're watching the mechanism execute in real time. Now, if this was just about Trump and Powell, it would be a political story. Interesting, but not systemic. But this is not just about two guys. This is about a pattern that has repeated itself for over 300 years, a pattern that has destroyed every major reserve currency in recorded history. And understanding this pattern is the only way to see what's coming next. Stage 1, central bank independence is established. It always starts the same way. A nation creates a central bank with monopoly control over money creation. The promise is always the same. The central bank will be independent from political pressure. It will manage the currency responsibly. It will prevent inflation. It will maintain stability. The Bank of England, 1694. The Reichsbank, 1876. The Federal Reserve, 1913. Same story every time. Independence promised, stability guaranteed. And for a while it works. Stage 2, debt expansion through money printing. Once the central bank exists, the government uses it to finance expansion. Wars, infrastructure, social programs, empire building. The government borrows and the central bank creates money to buy the bonds. Debt grows, but it looks fine because the economy is growing too. Britain in the 1800s expanding the empire. Germany in the 1920s rebuilding after World War I. The US from 1913 through the 1960s, funding wars and the New Deal and the Great Society. Everyone thinks they figured it out this time. Modern monetary management, scientific economics, the gold standard or Bretton Woods or whatever framework is in place. It's working. GDP is up, employment is up, the currency is strong. This time is different. Stage 3, political interference begins. This is where we are right now with Trump and Powell. Stage 3 starts when the debt becomes unpayable under normal circumstances, when the interest costs become too large, when the government can no longer afford to let the central bank act independently. At this point, the government starts pressuring the central bank to keep rates low and print money. The central bank resists at first. That's its mandate. That's why it exists, to prevent exactly this. But the pressure builds. The president calls the chairman an enemy. Governors get replaced with loyalists. Public votes signal the coming policy shift. And slowly, sometimes over years, the central bank's independence erodes. This happened in Britain in the early 1900s as the empire became too expensive to maintain. This happened in Germany in the early 1920s when reparations and political spending required the Reichsbank to print. This happened in the US in 1971 when Nixon needed cheap money and pressured Arthur Burns. And it's happening right now. January 28, 2026. Two governors voting against Powell, Chris Waller positioning to replace him in May. The independence is cracking. Stage 3 is executing. Stage 4, currency collapse and elite repositioning. This is the final stage, and it's the one that matters most because by stage 4, the outcome is inevitable. The central bank has lost independence. The government is printing to service unpayable debt. Inflation accelerates, the currency loses value. And here's the critical part. The elites who built the system, the financial institutions, the old money families, the people who understand the pattern, they move their wealth before the collapse becomes obvious. They buy hard assets, gold, real estate in other countries, stocks in rising powers. They reposition before the masses figure it out. This happened when British capital moved to America before the pound collapsed. This happened when American money moved into Germany during Weimar hyperinflation, made fortunes, then exited before the political collapse. This happened when Wall Street moved out of dollar assets as Bretton Woods failed. Same mechanism every time. By the time the population realizes the currency is collapsing, the repositioning is already complete. The elites are already safe, and the middle class gets left holding paper that's losing value by the day. 4 stages, same pattern, never fails to complete once it starts. And we are in stage 3 right now. The Fed vote on January 28th is proof. Let me show you how this played out. The last time a president interfered with the Fed. 1969, Richard Nixon becomes president. He inherits a growing problem. The U.S. has been running deficits to fund the Vietnam War and Lyndon Johnson's Great Society programs. Foreign central banks are holding massive amounts of dollars, and under the Bretton Woods system, those dollars are supposed to be redeemable for gold at $35 per ounce. But there's a problem. The U.S. has printed way more dollars than it has gold to back them. Nixon knows this, and he knows that if he doesn't get reelected in 1972, none of his political agenda matters. So he needs the economy running hot going into the election. He needs low unemployment. He needs growth. He needs cheap money. But the Fed chairman, Arthur Burns, is supposed to be independent. His job is to protect the dollar, not to get Nixon reelected. So Nixon applies pressure. He calls Burns to the White House repeatedly. He tells Burns that high interest rates are killing the economy. He makes it clear that Burns's reappoint depends on cooperation, and Burns slowly starts to comply. Interest rates come down, money supply expands, credit flows. The economy heats up going into 1972. Nixon wins re-election in a landslide, but the consequences are already in motion. By 1971, foreign governments see what's happening. They see the money printing. They see the inflation starting. And they start doing what the Bretton Woods Agreement allows them to do. They start redeeming their dollars for gold. France sends a battleship to New York Harbor in 1971 to collect French gold. Literally a battleship. Britain requests $3 billion in gold moved from Fort Knox to New York. Switzerland exits the system entirely on August 9th, August 15th, 1971. Sunday night, Nixon goes on television. He announces a temporary suspension of dollar convertibility to gold. Temporary. 55 years later, still in effect. The gold window closes. The Bretton Woods system collapses, and the dollar becomes pure fiat currency backed by nothing except government promise. What happened next? The dollar lost over 98% of its value against gold. In 1971, gold was $35 per ounce. Today, it's over $3,000. That's not gold going up. That's the dollar collapsing in slow motion over 5 decades. And it all started with a president who needed cheap money, interfering with a Fed chairman who was supposed to be independent, but wasn't strong enough to resist. Stage 3, complete. Political interference. Central bank independence destroyed. Stage 4, executed. Currency debasement. Elites repositioned into hard assets. Middle class left holding depreciating paper. Same pattern we're watching right now with Trump and Powell. Same pattern, different crisis. 2008, the housing bubble collapses. Lehman Brothers fails. Credit markets freeze. The entire financial system is on the edge of implosion. George W. Bush is president. Ben Bernanke is Fed chairman. And the pressure to act is enormous. Now, Bernanke is an academic. He studied the Great Depression. His entire research career was about how the Fed made mistakes in the 1930s by not acting aggressively enough. So when 2008 hits, Bernanke knows what he wants to do. Cut rates to zero, inject liquidity, buy assets, print money, prevent a deflationary spiral. But here's what people forget. The Fed's mandate is price stability and maximum employment, not save the banks, not rescue Wall Street, not prevent asset prices from falling. The Fed is supposed to manage the currency responsibly, but in 2008, that distinction disappeared. The Bush administration needed the Fed to save the financial system, and Bernanke complied. Rates went to zero. Quantitative easing began. The Fed started buying mortgage-backed securities, government bonds, agency debt. The Fed's balance sheet exploded from under $1 trillion before the crisis to over $4 trillion by 2015. That's money printing. The Fed creates reserves, buys assets, and the money enters the system. It's not literally printing physical cash, but the effect is the same. More dollars in circulation, each one worth less. And who benefited? The banks got bailed out. Wall Street got rescued, asset prices recovered. If you owned stocks, if you owned real estate, if you had wealth in financial assets, you got richer. The S&P 500 went from 666 in March 2009 to over 2,000 by 2015. If you were holding assets, you multiplied your wealth. But if you were working class, if your wealth was in your paycheck, in your savings account, you got inflation. Gas prices up, food prices up, healthcare up, education up, housing up. Your wages stayed flat while everything you needed to buy got more expensive. This wasn't an accident. This was the mechanism. The government couldn't afford to let the financial system collapse. So the Fed printed, and printing money always has the same effect. It transfers wealth from people who hold currency to people who hold assets. The middle class got destroyed. Wealth inequality exploded. And the people who understood what was happening, the people who moved into stocks and real estate and hard assets in 2009 and 2010, they made generational fortunes. Stage 3, political pressure on the Fed. Stage 4, money printing and wealth transfer. Same pattern as 1971. Same pattern as Britain before that. Same pattern as Germany. And it's about to happen again because Trump is facing the same choice Bush faced. Let the system collapse or force the Fed to print. And we already know which choice gets made. It always gets made the same way. The Fed prints the currency debases, and the people who see it coming reposition before it becomes obvious. So let's apply the pattern to right now. January 28th, 2026, Chris Waller votes against Powell. That's the signal. Trump's pick for the next Fed chairman is publicly breaking with Powell on the exact issue Trump cares about: rate cuts. 4 months from now, May 2026, Powell's term as chairman ends. Trump will nominate Waller or someone equally dovish. The Senate will confirm, and the new chairman will do exactly what Trump needs: cut rates, restart quantitative easing, support the Treasury market, print money to service the $36 trillion debt. You cannot avoid this. The math doesn't work any other way. You cannot pay $1.5 trillion per year in interest on a $36 trillion debt while running a $2 trillion deficit without either massive spending cuts, massive tax increases, or money printing. Spending cuts are politically impossible. Social Security, Medicare, defense, interest on the debt. Those 4 items alone consume almost all tax revenue. There's nothing left to cut that would matter. Tax increases are economically impossible. The economy is already fragile. Raising taxes enough to close a $2 trillion deficit would trigger a depression. That leaves printing. And printing requires a compliant Fed. And a compliant Fed requires removing Powell and installing someone like Waller. You cannot have $36 trillion in debt without currency debasement. You cannot maintain Fed independence when the debt is unpayable. You cannot avoid stage 4 once stage 3 begins executing. Here's what this means in practice. Rates will come down. Maybe not immediately. Maybe Powell holds firm for his last few months. But by summer 2026, the new chairman will cut 25 basis points at first, then another 25, then 50. By the end of 2026, Rates will be back under 3%. By 2027, they'll be approaching zero again. And the Fed will restart asset purchases. Call it QE4, QE5, whatever. The mechanics are the same. The Fed buys treasury bonds. The government gets cheap financing. The money supply expands. And when that happens, inflation returns. Not immediately. There's always a lag. 6 months, 12 months. But it comes because printing money to finance deficits always produces inflation. The dollar loses purchasing power. Your savings lose value. Everything priced in dollars gets more expensive. Gas, food, rent, healthcare, the cost of living rises faster than wages. The middle class gets squeezed again, just like 2021 and 2022. But the elites, they're already positioned. You think Wall Street doesn't see this coming? You think the people who moved 1.4 trillion into China during the trade war don't understand the pattern? They're buying hard assets right now. Gold, real estate, stocks, and companies with pricing power, commodities, foreign assets, anything that holds value when the currency debases. By the time this becomes obvious to the mainstream, by the time CNBC is talking about the Fed's latest QE program and inflation is back at 6%, the repositioning will already be complete. The contradiction is not an accident. It is the mechanism. Trump needs cheap money. The debt requires cheap money. The Fed will provide cheap money. The dollar will debase, and the people who understand this will position themselves accordingly before it becomes obvious to everyone else. The vote on January 28th wasn't about interest rate policy. It was confirmation that Stage 3 is executing. Stage 4 is coming. The only question is whether you see it in time. This is not prediction. This is pattern recognition. The same mechanism that moved British capital to America in the 1800s as the pound lost reserve status. The same mechanism that destroyed the German middle class in 1923 through hyperinflation. The same mechanism that took the dollar off gold in 1971. The same mechanism that printed $4 trillion after 2008. It's executing again right now. And the signal came on January 28, 2026, when 2 Fed governors voted against Jerome Powell. You understand that the $36 trillion debt cannot be paid at current interest rates. You understand that Trump cannot cut spending enough or raise taxes enough to matter. You understand that the only mathematical solution is currency debasement. You understand that currency debasement requires Fed cooperation. You understand that Fed cooperation requires removing Powell and installing a dovish chairman. And you understand that Chris Waller just publicly auditioned for that role. Stage 3 is executing the political interference phase. The phase where central bank independence cracks under the weight of unpayable debt. We've seen this in Britain. We've seen this in Germany. We've seen this in America in 1971 and 2008. And we're seeing it again right now. The pattern does not care about your political preferences. It does not care whether you voted for Trump or against him. It does not care about economic theory or modern monetary theory or any intellectual framework designed to explain why this time is different. This time is not different. The mechanism is mathematical. And when Stage 4 executes, when the printing starts, when inflation returns, the people who positioned early will preserve their wealth. The people who waited until it became obvious will lose. That's how it always works. By the time the mainstream understands what's happening, asset prices have already adjusted. Gold is already at $4,000. Real estate has already repriced. Stocks and inflation-protected sectors have already run. The opportunity to reposition at reasonable prices is gone. So what do? You understand that holding assets denominated purely in a currency that's being debased is a choice to participate in the wealth transfer mechanism. You understand that the next 5 years will not look like the last 10. You understand that the Fed will print because the alternative is default, and you position yourself accordingly. If you want to see how Stage 4 completes, if you want to understand what the final phase of this pattern looks like, if you want to know which assets preserve wealth during currency debasement and which ones get destroyed, subscribe now, because this channel exists to show you the pattern while it's still executing, rather than explaining it after the collapse is complete. Like this video if you saw what happened on January 28th for what it really was. Subscribe if you want to see what comes next, and comment below if you're already positioned or if you're still deciding, because the vote wasn't about interest rates. It was about a $36 trillion debt that cannot be paid. And the pattern that's destroyed every reserve currency in history just moved into Stage 3. Your dollars are in the crossfire.